Elsa, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, we don't know that. It might be terrible. Let's see how the next hour and a half goes.
Perpetual optimist, what can I say?
No, what's it? I'm a realistic optimist. I think that's a category I put myself in. Elsa, we've known each other for some time. I think when you were working at CBA as an EGM, we first met, and you invited me along to see your partner play in a band at the Coogee Legion. Those were good old days, eh?
They were, and the band is still out there. We now have our own T-shirts printed with 15 years of underground sound, because even though the band has made around 14 albums, and we've recently gotten into doing our own videos using Dolly and some of the other tools that are out there. The band is still traveling right underneath the radar, sadly.
I love it. Well, you never know. One day, maybe this is the big break. Maybe the Thunderlab's huge audience will be the lightning bolt that the band needs. What's the band called again?
The band is called Storm Cellar.
Storm Cellar. That's it.
Yeah. When we first started it, we were quite concerned that people would think that it was some kind of archaic reference to, people that played a different kind of music than what we do. But it's very much it's evolved from an R&B band into a much more modern, lots of influences. World during COVID, we created an album and did live streaming, and the album had artists from 9 different countries. And 4 different languages are spoken on the album, so it's not a normal R&B type of group anymore. Yeah. It's evolved over time.
Well, we put the band and your experiences with that into this category of things that you and I talk about fairly often, and I think that's why we're together today. I mean, honestly, I'm not quite sure where this adventure is going to take us. Hopefully somewhere good, but. And there's many themes that we talked about before we just came on air, and we've talked about in the past that I'm not sure how they go for public consumption, but let's just give it a shot, right, and see what happens.
Sure.
I always start off with this, with like, what's on your mind at the moment, Elsa? And just as a general lead-in, again, we've known each other for a while, and one of the things that really gets me, that we've talked about, is the state of employment for mature individuals and them finding opportunity. Even like yourself, they've occupied senior roles for a 20-year stint at places like the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Mm-hmm. And I just don't get it. I mean, I do, but I don't. Mm-hmm. I don't get this problem of employing experienced people, and then on one hand, and then on the other hand, saying, "Oh, there's not enough people to do work." Mm. And I know I led in with, what's on your mind and what do you care about at the moment. But this thing is really bothering me, and it's one of the many things that you said that you might discuss. So, we could start there, or you can lead in with whatever else you choose. But this thing it's on my mind, and I can't shake it. So, like, what the F is going on?
Well, there's a couple of things that are contributing to this, and I've just come off the back of delivering a course on DEI for some senior executives at a worldwide organization, and the spread of the age range of the people in that group was probably, maybe mid-20s to, I think, probably our oldest participant would have been maybe in his mid-40s. And part of the thing that we have to tackle within the entire DEI sphere is people's perceptions, right? So what we have is, we know that there are about 164 cognitive biases that people that have actually been researched and detailed and named. Now, everybody has bias, whether it's conscious or it's unconscious. And the reason that we have bias is because our brain And I have a real passion in neuroscience, so done a lot of study in that. So I'll be talking about the human brain when we're talking about a lot of this stuff. Our brain likes to have shortcuts because it has so much information to process. So what happens is our brain looks for these shortcuts, and we immediately go into a knee-jerk kind of reaction on things, and we don't stop to actually think things through, which is where things like discrimination and leaving people out of the picture come from, because we are almost programmed to go through this kind of let's make a quick decision. We did a quick survey in the class, asking people about, different aspects of ageism and diversity and things like that. And what it came out is that, especially in things like age, so if we're talking about mature workers, our idea of what is old is starting to become formed when we're around 4 years old. And then as we grow, that reinforcement of what it means to be older is constantly refed, recycled until by the time we're in our 20s or 30s, we think that old is, somebody walking across the road with a cane hunched over and, dribbling in their soup. But there's been an interesting change, not only in demographics, and I'll touch on that briefly, but there's something called the longevity effect. And what that means is that as we have gotten better educated, as we have gotten healthier, as we have learned to, use our resources, our natural resources better, our biological age and our chronological age have grown further and further apart. So if we looked at pictures back in the 1800s of people that were, 18 years old, they look old, right? They look old. And even when I was growing up, although I was blessed to have really healthy, active grandparents, there were people when I was growing up that were in, 65, 70, and you thought, wow, they're old. But the reality is that now that isn't actually what's happening. They aren't actually old. And what we're finding is that we haven't let go of that. We haven't let go of that stereotype. And that's because part of it is reinforced by the media that surrounds us. So AARP, which is the organization in America that looks after retired persons predominantly, did a quick study of what was going on in the media around us. And they found that even though the American population of older is represented by well over 30% of the population now, they only were shown in media, print, and other forms of advertising at around 1.5%. So when we do see old people, they're always depicted as old rather than actually seeing people that are young. Now Hollywood has started to buck that trend because you've got, terrific actors like, Jane Fonda and certainly, people like Clint Eastwood and other individuals like that are still actively contributing well past their use-by date. And so movies are starting to maybe change and adapt, but still that representation, a positive representation of older people in our world is still only around, it's gone up to about 6%. So if all we get are reinforced images of old people, when of course somebody goes to hire somebody and they look for, they want somebody who's experienced, they want somebody who's, got the right stuff, has done all the right things, but they want fresh ideas, they want dynamic ideas. They immediately think that the minute that you turn a certain age, you can no longer be dynamic. You can no longer think of fresh ideas. And once again, the evidence around us doesn't support that. So we find that, we've got, I love the fact that William Shatner went up into space, and he's been the oldest person up in space. He was, went up and did that. Older people are no longer aging the same way. And so quite what makes sense is that their contributions then are actually still significant. We still have people inventing, we still have scientists, we have people out there finding new discoveries, and they aren't 22 years old. They aren't 30 years old. There are people that have taken their entire life, because the way that the human brain works is that we amass a lot of information, and the older brain is able to better make connections with the information. So if you think about, if you picture the difference between a young brain and an old brain, a young brain is taking in information like it's building pylons, right? So it's building pylons of information about this, a pylon of information about that. It's almost taking in all of this stuff and building these constructs. While an older brain is actually the bridge over the top of those pylons, because while we don't remember everything, and nobody does, our memory is selective and we can only hold on to so much information regardless of our age. What happens in an older brain is we are able to actually pull those information pylons together and make connections. And out of those connections will come creativity. Out of those connections will come innovation, you know? And so people think that, you know, you get old and set in your ways, but neuroplasticity means that we can keep on learning until the day we die. You know, that saying of you can't teach an old dog new tricks is basically not true. We know now that our brains keep on growing, keep on developing, we keep on taking in new information, and it's how we build those connections in our brains. And that's the benefit that we're missing by not bringing more mature aged workers into the situation. We think that they aren't dynamic, that they can't bring fresh perspectives. But the reality is that their historical reference, as well as their lived experience, gives them an opportunity to think outside of the box.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, the summary, if you like, is there's not enough representation. There is not enough understanding. And what I'm hearing is that you know, let's not call it role models, but role models that show the path in industry aren't yet ubiquitous. They're not commonplace because, you know, people are being sidelined because traditionally we've had lack of representation, lack of understanding, and therefore there aren't the people in the workforce that have paved the way. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think that when we're talking about business, and I do like to quote numbers because I think quoting numbers is really important. So the cost of this ageism that we're experiencing is staggering. And in the US alone, where older workers experience involuntary retirement, underemployment, or unemployment, the US economy has lost, this is a big number now, $850 billion as a result of not using the workforce that they have to their best, right? And by 2050, they suspect, or they're forecasting, that losses could reach $3.9 trillion in the US alone because of the changing demographics, right? We've got people that are sitting on the bench that should be contributing, not only contributing to the welfare of society, but also contributing, frankly, to the tax base and the profit margins. Whereas
is that what those stats are based on? What are the stats based on? What's the 850 billion loss attributed to?
That was done by a research branch of AARP and confirmed by a couple of universities. So it's a stat that is basically based on looking at the overall loss of those people that are sitting on the bench. So if you have somebody 60 years old, they're making 120K, they're contributing X amount of tax, then they suddenly get cut from that. All that tax money is gone, all that contribution is gone. So it's basically quite credible science that they actually came up with those figures, and that is in the US alone. Obviously, it's easier in the U.S. because we can't necessarily track the same thing in, sub-Saharan, parts of Africa because they don't have the same level of data ability. But certainly, if we're looking at the weird world, your white, industrialized, educated, rich democracy type of world, this is a real factor, and it's already started to play out in places like Japan, where they're looking at a declining birth rate that's been going down since 2019. Their birth rate now used to be 2.9. I think it's now 2.6. So it's dropping, and it's dropping every single day. China is also now significantly experiencing a change in demographics, where after many years of an enforced social policy to reduce the number of children, because they had such a tremendous amount of overpopulation, that has a long tail effect. And women in China are no longer interested in staying home and having children and having that to be their main focus. They've spent a lot of time now out of the house and want to do different things. They also are concerned about looking after themselves. So you've got a different change, and now China's trying to say, well, listen, you need to go back to doing what you used to do, because we need you to create babies, because if you don't create babies, you won't create future consumers, and you won't create future workers, and how are we going to pay for all the old people, and da-da-da-da-da. So it's really going to, I think, in the next couple of years, really start to hit home. And I, for one, would like to see Australia take the lead on appreciating that we need to use the workforce at hand. We need to recognize the demographics. And we also need to appreciate that there are some things that take more than 2 or 3 years to get good at. If you think about some of the things that we learn, some of the things that we put together, that learning process can go for several years. Mm-hmm. I'm drawn to, especially in Australia, we have a great example recently that happened with Optus. So we know that Optus crashed, and it crashed so badly, and its recovery was so badly that the CEO of Optus had to step away, kind of fall on her sword and say, this was a really bad thing. But the underlying cause of the problem is that when she came in and started her tenure, she wanted a fresh, dynamic team, let go of all of her senior IT people. And when the crash happened, there was nobody who knew how to fix the problem, because everybody that knew how to fix the problem had exited the company, either voluntarily or not voluntarily. So they actually had to call them up and ask them to come back in to kind of get things back up and running. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, they didn't then keep them on. They went ahead and released them again. So let's hold our breath that something else doesn't happen. So it would be great to see Australia go, hey, we've got this terrific resource. We're still a small country, but growing, and we're on the edge of taking over some really good opportunities in terms of, the environment and other things. Let's keep those senior people on, and let's tap what they know. And then not only can we tap what they know, but they can help us grow by coaching and supporting the people that are younger than them. And that's something I think that we're keenly missing. All we think about is that older people aren't tech savvy. They aren't digital natives. I'm making videos using DALL-E. Come on, really? There's nothing to stop you from embracing technology, other than maybe sometimes having somebody give you a hand. But then again, I would suggest that there are people that might not know how to bake a loaf of bread and would benefit from learning how to bake a loaf of bread from somebody who's been a baker for a long time.
Mm-hmm. So it leads to a thought to me. I can't think of a better word than prejudice. And it strikes me as unusual because, inevitably, everybody in the workforce will end up as a mature employee unless they're independently wealthy, or have, gotten lucky or whatever. But even the wealthiest of executives that I meet still want to add value. They still want to contribute. So, I apply the prejudice to those that need to work and those that want to work. And I wonder what your thought is if that prejudice arises because, even though we're all inevitably marching towards maturity or age, is it because of our experiences of our parents and how we see them or our grandparents, and therefore we're applying the prejudice of how our own family dynamics work to the workplace? I mean, I can't. I mean, I'm no scientist on this, but I just wonder if that is the case.
Yeah, certainly that's a big contributing factor. But also, too, what contributes to our, I guess, our sense of older people comes a lot from the media. So if you look at how many articles are out there on a regular basis in the media about Alzheimer's and and dementia, and oh my gosh, everything is about, everybody's getting old, and do you know that there's 45 million people now that are suffering from dementia, and this is bad, and old people and so we get almost inundated by the media to reinforce this underlying stereotypes, and that constant reinforcement of that does start to jade and color how we actually perceive things. And when we look at then, if we clear all that away, and goodness knows critical thinking skills are another one of my big moments of, I think everybody really needs to embrace critical thinking skills, especially in the media landscape that we have today. The number of people that have Alzheimer's proportional to the size of the older population is less than like 3 or 4%. Right? So you would think that everybody who got old got Alzheimer's. The only thing that we know for sure is that everybody who lives to a very old age will definitely get things like, you'll definitely get glaucoma, because that's just an aging part of your body, right? But we now replace that, right? We can tackle glaucoma. Today in the newspaper there was 3 articles about, one, that they believe that the increase in dementia can be tied directly to, in some cases, environmental underlying factors. So, as I said before, my grandparents were quite well blessed. My grandmother was 99 years old and smoking cigars, drinking whiskey, and swearing politely in Danish, and was not compromised at all. Neither were either sets of my other grandparents. But nowadays, we're seeing that people that live along roadways that are heavily trafficked have higher lead content in their brain, and they start to suffer dementia earlier. We're also looking at things, scientists are looking at things, the plaque buildup that causes dementia and Alzheimer's in the brain is actually part of a factor of not getting enough exercise, not socializing enough, and they are now developing a nasal spray that looks like it's going to be able to start working to reverse those problems in the brain and dissolve those plaques. So while we do have a health challenge as a result of people getting older, it's not an inevitable ending to everybody, right? It's going to be something that is going to be treatable. It's going to be easily addressed. And part of it is the result of everybody living older, but part of it is also the environment that we live in, part of that has affected it. That's why when they always talk about those people on that one island in Italy or Sicily or something, they're still walking up and they're walking up and down the hills, and they're digging vegetables and stuff like that, and they're 104 years old because their island is quite isolated, and the way that they actually approach life is you work until you die. And it's not bad work, it's work contributing. And when you have that kind of an isolated population, and you go, wait a minute, why is this working and why is this not working? Well, it's obvious that this is working for very clear reasons, whereas this is not, because it's supporting a different end game. We want to get young people out there, we want to get them working. Well, yes, but we're forgetting everything that, it's like people don't think that history is important. We don't need to worry about history, but if we don't study what happened, we won't be able to stop it from happening again. So.
I acknowledge what you're saying about, efforts being focused on getting young people out into the workforce, which is true. I mean, they have their whole life ahead of them. I also acknowledge what you've said about people forgetting or overlooking or prejudicing against experience for some reason. And I think that, people might not listen to this whole thing, but perhaps at this very moment there's an opportunity for a condensed insight. And this is what I would ask you. If you could offer a lightning bolt to insights to any executive in a hiring position right now looking to hire, maybe seeing mature or experienced people, what lightning bolt of insight would you offer them that perhaps they haven't considered, aside from what we've talked about?
Yeah. When they look at older workers, they came up with a very large list of the benefits of having older workers on your team. Things like cross-pollination of ideas, things like being able to look at previous experiences and be able to better suggest a better strategic path, being more innovative based on, once again, their previous experience. So if you're hiring somebody who's older and you want to get somebody in that job who's going to be stable, who's going to be loyal, most older workers stay in their positions, new positions, once they've actually been able to get a new position. They stay in their position around 10.6 years. Younger workers, anyone below the age of around 35, 40 years old, their tenure position is around 3.6 years. So, and we know that every single time you replace an employee, it costs you more money, right? Because there's an investment that goes out the door. So I think that, like a fine wine, sometimes it's really good to go with something that's got a little bit of age, because you're going to benefit from that in a way that you hadn't expected, that you hadn't necessarily even planned on. And I think that older workers bring a balance to a workforce. We know that intergenerational teams are 33% more productive. We also know that intergenerational teams have a greater sense of engagement. Intergenerational teams also have a higher rate of success when it comes to innovation. And another really important thing for me, and I think that this is critical, is that older workers also engender a better approach to customer service. Mm-hmm. And if in a lot of companies, the only thing that's going to differentiate you between you and your competitor is your level of customer service, and that is a truism that has held true for many, many years, wouldn't you want to do something that will give you multiple benefits, as well as the jewel in the crown of having that better approach to dealing with the customers? There's always intergenerational tensions, and that's just part of living. Back in the 60s, long-haired hippies. Nowadays, it's kids don't want to look up from their phone. They don't want to talk on the phone. They don't want to actually do all this kind of stuff because they've been raised in a different environment. When you get a balance of people, doesn't make it. They'll learn to talk on the phone, and older people will learn to use that phone better. I mean, something like 68% of everybody over the age of 55 has a smartphone. So once again, there's a lot of reality that is in conflict to perception. Mm. So I it's hard to put it in a soundbite. So I guess the one thing is hire older workers. You will get more benefits and more positives than you possibly are imagining.
I think a weakness that I have is that everything you're saying makes sense. Mm-hmm. And why it's a weakness is I just still don't get it. And I just don't get it. We're a tiny organization, and I wouldn't hesitate to think of hiring whoever, whatever. A real I'd like to think a real mindset of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I really mean it,
Hmm. Hmm.
and I don't mean it in any virtue signaling way either.
Hmm.
And I can't help but think at the moment that age-based diversity isn't popular. It doesn't have the headlines. It's underrepresented even as a slither of the diversity spectrum, because I just don't get it. I mean, I was talking to someone this morning, and most of the team at this company, most of, are in their late 40s and 50s, funnily. And that's not because we've chosen to ignore anybody younger, but they want to do different things to what we want to do as an organization. And I've also, without going too far down, I also had some wonderful experiences in my late 20s employing someone in their late 50s, early 60s while they worked for me. And it was a game changer. There were some challenges, I have to admit, but it was a game changer for me as a young manager. Just a cool head in certain circumstances and fundamental reliability. I mean, it changed everything for me. I did a couple of other employees, but I noticed them as a part of a team, acknowledge their efforts.
Yeah.
So I guess struggling because I don't get it. So this is the sort of an elephant in my mind that I'm addressing.
Right.
How do mature people not serve themselves in this? What is it that, you mentioned a guy before that has made 80 interviews 80 applications with not a single interview, a very senior executive, whether you know him or not personally, I don't know, but what's he doing wrong?
Well,
or how's he not serving himself? Because maybe he's
yeah.
not doing anything wrong. How's he not serving himself?
Yeah. So because we have these underlying stereotypes that actually then roll into becoming prejudices, what we have to do is we have to step back and look at the corporate structure and think about, how do people get into organizations? How do we hire people today? And a couple of things to point out is that the average age of a corporate recruiter is around 26 to 28 years old. So you've got people that are recruiting people in. Now, you actually were in a different situation, because I assume you actually looked at the resumes that you received, and you actually read through those resumes and actually did some interviewing. Whereas your 26 to 28-year-old recruiter is trying to push as many people in as they possibly can, as quickly as they can, because that's how they get their KPIs met. So first off, they aren't willing to maybe take the time to actually look at these resumes or actually interview the people. In fact, we know that AI bots, and I use the term AI lightly because, of course, we don't necessarily have AI, we just have large language models, but the AI bots that sit in front of the recruitment process, those gatekeepers, were programmed by people who didn't actually think about thinking outside the box. So the bots, most people don't make it past the AI bots. And so if you've got a corporate situation where they rely on the gatekeeper bots to winnow down the tremendous amount of applications that they get so that they can focus on what the AI bot has decided are the best people for this job, most people over a certain age don't even make it through the door. What can they do? I'm not really too sure about that. I have struggled with this myself. How do you get somebody's attention if you can't get past the first mark off the door? People have taken to doing their cover letters, to doing their resumes using AI, in hopes that their AI resume will talk to the AI bot and let them through the door. Sometimes that works. More often it doesn't, because once again, the minute that you have 20 plus years experience, you're kind of reduced. So I spoke to somebody recently who got a job after applying for about 20 roles, and he finally got in. in the door. But he had taken his resume and basically carved it down to the last 10 years. Now, this is a guy who's got tremendous experience, right? But he didn't even list it on his resume, because if it's on his resume, it means that he's old. So he doesn't put it on his resume in the hopes that he'll at least get an interview where he can then say, oh, by the way, I also have this experience, and this experience. So it's almost like you have to game the system. So, and it's not just the people that are trying to get in the door that know this. A study done recently showed that 9 out of 10 managers know and feel that the applicants that they are given to review for a job are not the best applicants. But that's what they have been delivered in this kind of commercial packaging up of, this is what it is. We also see things, when we talk about hiring people, they use words like, we want somebody who's a digital native. We want somebody who's, got fresh ideas. We've got this, we've got that, So they almost narrow their field search down to a certain age demographic before they even get to what are the requirements of the job. So it's kind of a catch-22, situation. We would need people such as yourself, but also in corporate settings, to kind of go, show me the pile of people that didn't make it through the gate. Let me see 5 or 10 of those people that didn't even make it through the first hurdle. And I'm specifically looking for any person who's a woman over 50. I want any man who's over 50. I want somebody who's maybe not a native English speaker, because this also impacts diversity in terms of culture as well as other things. You would have to become re-engaged with the hiring process at a person-to-person level rather than a machine level. That's what it would take to make the difference. Or we go back in and we rejig those large language models and we change the algorithms that they're using to weed people out. I understand that it's great to have an algorithm that weeds people out if you've ever been convicted of a felony or this or that, those seriously big issues that probably you do want to kind of, curtail that selective pool. But unless we willingly and purposefully change our selection pool, we won't actually be able to address this problem, and it will continue to build and grow and build and grow. And as pointed out by the stats coming out of the States and the demographics that we know, we are going to end up shooting ourselves in the foot. We already are shooting ourselves in the foot to a great extent, and that will only get worse because the declining population is not going to turn around in 5 years. Or 10 years. It will take 20 years for that declining population at least to start turning around, because while we might have more babies, we can't put them to work in factories. They aren't going to be able to go into the office when they're 10 years old. So they still need to, first off, make the babies, grow the babies, and then actually get them out into the workforce. So you're looking at 20 years. Well, that's 20 years of people sitting on the bench that you aren't using while you're waiting for your next cohort to come through. And it's, people do silly things. And, I often reflect on the Darwin Awards myself and go, oh yeah, that didn't really make a lot of sense, did it? And I think that this lack of having mature workers in an organization is a potential Darwin Award waiting to happen.
Mm. Yeah, it's a fascinating thought experiment, but it's not just a thought experiment, it's actually playing out. I mean, we have a temporary reprieve in this current market exactly today because of, in my view, suppressed open jobs, which means there's a surplus of people that people might put in that bucket. The words you used before were dynamic and fresh, and I'm blown away by how many friends that I know and would look up to are on the market looking at the moment now. So I think employers are spoiled for choice. But as that momentum shifts and there are, more jobs but less applicants, it's like those organizations are prepared for diversity and perhaps to take a look at ageism, inherent ageism and the cognitive bias that's pre-programmed or media programmed into us. Perhaps they might be well placed. I asked before about what mature people how they aren't serving themselves, how they aren't helping, not that's their fault, but how they're not helping. And I'll go all the way back to something you said at the beginning, and I can't remember if it was in our preamble or in the talk, but no, it was in the talk. You talked about young brains still building the pillars and the foundations. So I'm imagining that, and old brains build a bridge, and so that they connect those principles. But then that comes back to an issue in terms of bias in people that are able to build the bridge really quickly because they've already seen this. I've been there. I've done that. I know this will or won't work. I'm a manifestation of that. I'm not set in my ways, but I am experienced. I've never felt fitter for what I'm doing today than I have in my whole career, more prepared. But I do see the patterns, and it means that I wonder what my patience is like for, experimentation that's doomed to fail. So if I'm a microcosm of that mature, experienced market, then maybe that's one of the ways that we aren't serving ourselves. I don't know, but it is a thought, because just because you have the knowledge, sometimes I need to have the wisdom to step back and not necessarily express that. And I wonder with age if that becomes more difficult. I don't know, but it's a conundrum. And all of this is, I feel on a treadmill myself, Elsa. I feel on a treadmill to be relevant. I'm very privileged in this way that I spend 1,000 meetings a year talking to people like you across the broad spectrum. So I'm sitting as where I am today. I'm nearly 50, and I'm looking forward, going, I am terrified of not being career relevant. And I'm there now. And I'm there now because of some choices I've made over the years. And so I'm reflecting on, am I doing myself a disservice by having the knowledge and maybe not the wisdom to hold back? And am I really over egging it, thinking about being career relevant now as I approach my 50th year? Because it's a thing I see playing out all the time. Again, whether people are wealthy or not wealthy, being career relevant is something that they covet. Happens at a young age, I know. So I'm not trying to print sectionalities. It happens all the way through our careers. Yes. I observe it's difficult in 50s and 60s for career relevance. It's a conundrum.
It is, but I think that if you embrace the concept of continuous learning, so I would suggest that even though you are saying this is the experience that I have, this is how things have been going, when we get the occasional black swan events or things like the pandemic, everything that you thought you knew might not be what you need to know now. And unless you adapt to what you need to know now, what you knew before will not actually see you through to the future. So it's the ability to, and recognizing, once again, let's go back to neuroplasticity. The brain keeps on learning. The more stuff we put in there, the more the brain's going to take that information and, make their little engrams and, store it in our hippocampus and all that good kind of stuff. That keeps on happening. So if we think about, if I grow old, will I lose my relevance? You only, growing old is more of a sometimes I think a state of mind rather than just that sense of things. So as you grow old, do you reach out and want to learn new things? Do you want to understand new things? And if in fact you are constantly looking for that continuous learning, I think that staying relevant goes along with that appreciation of continuous learning. I recently, not too long ago, picked up my Agile Scrum Master certificate. I'd obviously been trained in waterfall software development. I always found it a bit slow and tedious anyway. So I was really excited with Agile. So, I put my hand up and said, hey, I want to do this. Let me learn this. Let me learn something new. And then when I look at what I've learned in Agile, I combine it with my experience. And so my appreciation of Agile is a little bit different than somebody who never knew waterfall and comes in and does Agile. And that's how they think things go forward. So once again, it's about taking that knowledge and growing that knowledge. And I think that's how we stay relevant. Plus, the world as we know it is changing. The products that are being offered, the way that we do business, everything is changing. So there's going to be a lot of stuff that nobody knows, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's about committing to getting on the journey of continuous learning and continuous adapting to your circumstances. And we know that resilience is actually a lot stronger with your mature workers than with your younger workers, who are also suffering from ageism quite a bit. And I think you as a father would appreciate this, that there's nothing more scary than turning little boys and little girls into sexualized adults, right? And in America right now, the state of Arkansas has just passed a law reducing the age for child labor, legal child labor, down to 13 years old. And they have children working in slaughterhouses up to their elbows in blood and muck at the age of 14. That's not good for them either, right? So as much as we're kind of neglecting the older workforce, we're also putting much more pressure on the younger cohort to suddenly step up and take on much more responsibility and much more, I guess, accountability when, the human brain doesn't even finish developing in men until around the age of 27, a little bit earlier for women because, we reproduce. So nature built us in a little bit quicker to be able to take care of the young. But if the average male brain doesn't even solidify or even start to, finish its kind of that really initial thing until 27 years old, why are we expecting 22-year-olds to make decisions that are simply not theirs? That's why so many young people today are not leaving home. They aren't going out. They can't survive in a world where there is so much debt, there is so much, cost of living. So we're almost kind of, we're losing these people at the end. We're putting these people in front of the firing squad to kind of take on all this responsibility. And you think, well, why don't we just kind of roll that back a little bit and work out a way to kind of make this whole thing work better together? We can do that, We can do it, but we have to do it consciously. It won't happen naturally. What will happen is we will end up rolling off the cliff, and then suddenly people will get into a panic. And that's certainly what's happening in places like China and Japan, where their workforce is aging so rapidly, and they do not have that replacement workforce coming up. And a lot of this is tied to this idea of continuous growth. We must continually grow. We must continually produce. And I think that we're also at a point, given our ecological imperatives that we're kind of dealing with, that it might be time to step back from that commitment to continuous and growth and look at sustainability. They're starting to talk about it. We're talking about environmental sustainability, governance, those kinds of things. These are starting to come to the fore. Sustainability links into DEI quite neatly because we want to have a sustainable workforce. We want to be able to actually move forward. We want to also bring people up through the ranks and give them the opportunity to grow and learn. And that takes intergenerational workforce to make that happen. It's good for them. It's good for the older people as well, and certainly everybody in the middle benefits.
I might loop back to something that we talked about that you mentioned, because we know each other reasonably well enough, let's say. And I don't doubt passion. I don't doubt that you're good at it, and I don't doubt that money can be made at it. I'm talking about, is it ikigai or dharma? The principles of follow your passion.
Yeah.
So you got passion, being good at it. Can you make money at it? And does the world need it? It's called ikigai, but I always mispronounce that. And if you listen to any of the previous podcast episodes, I've done it about 20 times now. So I don't doubt mature people's continuous improvement desire. If the problem is the world doesn't know that it needs it yet. It's not an intrinsic state, it's an extrinsic factor about other people perceiving that continuous improvement. It's like, that person you mentioned at AT&T, they're always learning and doing those stuff. But the perception might be, they've got a lot of time on their hands and money, and therefore they're just learning. And it's a fantasy.
It is.
It's not. It's because they're looking for relevance. They're looking for ways to make cash. They not that there's anything wrong with being an Uber driver or a delivery, but it blows my mind, the people I meet, and I'm like, it's like they're just trying to find relevance because the world yet hasn't recognized that, as you say, 30% of the workforce is of a aged population, and it's not represented in the workforce. And we're fighting for this a diversity workplace. I mean, this is obviously a soapbox of mine because it's a personal fear I've felt, and it's a very large representative group. And by the way, every other intersectionality is represented in the aged group. It's not divisive in that way. It's inclusive, and so I recognize what you've said about continuous improvement. My issue is around waking up the world to the benefits of that particular diversity sliver, which is not slither, it's a slice, it's 30% of the market. And that's what I'm not getting, because I do recognize what you've said about the makeup and age is a state of mind. Because I personally can't believe that I'm nearly 50, as I say. Sorry, my cat's just saying hello.
That's all right.
I just can't believe that in myself. I don't feel it. So, I was thinking about how people, maybe don't serve themselves. And this is of any age group. And I wrote something based on what you said, that it feels to me that the world is clambering for recognition and prestige. So, because the recognition and prestige is perceived to be the path to all the things that people might want. And I noticed a certain segment don't clamber for relevance and prestige. But so then the opposite stairway is one that's down because they lose relevance over time. It's not a slide, but it is a step down. And it's this thing that I'm playing with at the moment, is that we unfortunately, and I'm a manifestation of that with the work that you see that I do around brand and LinkedIn. It's because I'm aware that people will choose sometimes prestige over competence. And it's a game, and that I feel compelled to play the game so that me and the 30-odd employees that I have, aren't overlooked, and that we're relevant, and we're relevant in a way that's relevant to the world at the moment. And it feels tricky because I was asking you, what are we doing wrong? And I think that two things come to mind. Continuous improvement alone isn't enough, because the world needs to be aware of it. And the second thing is, it is a game. And this relevance, this relevance through the prestige play, it's kind of got to be done. And it's sick. Like, it's a sickness, but it has to be done.
But I think also too, if we look back historically, what we have considered to be, the key indicators of what's important. Once upon a time, it became imperative that you get a college degree, and then you get a master's degree, and then you go on this path. I think Australia is one of the first, I think, or one of the leading countries in recognizing that academic achievement is not the only way to achieve success in life. That there is, that we need plumbers, we need electricians, we need emergency workers, we need conservation workers, and that some of that training, that vocational training, is just as important as academic training. So Australia's kind of already opened the door to the idea that, it's just, apprenticeships and learning how to do things and spending, years learning your trade is also very valuable. So I think that there's echoes in there that kind of allow for that to happen, that most of us in the corporate world sometimes completely overlook. If you ask somebody in the corporate world, how long does it take to become a plumber? They might go, yeah, I don't know, a year or two, something like that. No, it takes many more years than that to actually do that kind of thing. So I think if we think about how do we compete with wanting to be relevant in a world where the game has kind of been decided for us, I would probably, I would think about somebody, and I know that he can be controversial, but if you think about Malcolm Gladwell and you think about some of the other people that have written a lot of books recently, it might be the way to carve a path is to be an outlier, right? To be the organization that does stand outside the mix of everybody else and does so proudly and does so openly and says, you might be going along with this kind of thing, and this is the road that you're on. But guess what? We have something else to offer that you probably didn't even know that you didn't know. But we know it, and we're here, and we can deliver it. We can deliver it differently, but we can also deliver it effectively. And so I think it's almost having to rebrand yourself as being bigger than the stream, and there's a lot to be said for that outlier behavior. Certainly when we look at a lot of tech startups and we look at a lot of the stuff that's going on in science and things like that, we've got a lot of people thinking outside the box and going beyond the standard way of approaching things. And I think that those are the people that will lead us down a newer path, is by putting their hand up and going, yeah, we can do that, but what's more important is we can do this, right? And you didn't even know you needed this, but we can do this, right? So I think it's that selling, it's basically selling beyond the square. You need to sell outside the square. You need to encompass the square and internalize the square, because that's not hard to do, frankly, because basically the reference points are not astronomical anymore, right? So you need to embrace the square, but then you need to say, but I'm bigger than the square. I stand outside the square. Yes, I can do the square, but I can also do this and this and this. And I think that might be a way to start generating a different approach, is by acknowledging, yes, you want A, and you could probably be happy with B, but guess what? I can give you C, D, and E for the same thing that you were just looking for with A, because I bring all of this to the table, not just this to the table.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. The way that I articulate that is that is if you're building a football team, then hire people that can play out of position. Not just for the position, because they could be equally good anywhere on the pitch. It's a thing that I recognize as people get more experienced, it's harder to articulate in a way that feels knowledgeable and wise without being overwhelming or boastful. And it's a real challenging conundrum. I'm going to loop back to another thought that you had because it's not the fault of AI and those who have programmed AI. I mean, I worked in recruitment for 10 years before moving into consultancy and gaming and whatnot. And I wasn't equipped, I wasn't equipped for any of it. I mean, I was good at it, by the way. And what the good traditional metric and measure is in recruitment is different to what people might think. But I was good at it, but I don't know that I was equipped for it. And I think the revelations of not being equipped for it are what made me equipped for it today. But again, it's taken 2.5 decades. And I think that it's a problem of the type of, I'm not saying all, because there's many equipped young people doing recruitment work, by the way. That actually blows my mind how good many of them are. But the metrics they're held to aren't necessarily the metrics that solve this particular problem we're talking about, which is diversity, maybe leveraging an aged group as opposed to a gender group or some other intersectionality. So it's a real conundrum that I feel like I want to do something about, Elsa, which is the point of why we're here today, right? It's really on my mind.
I think that the one thing that is the big, I guess the looming large, for me, elephant in the room is that the problems that we are facing, both at local and global arenas, are getting more and more complex. They're becoming problems that we have never actually tackled before. And in some cases, they are problems that we don't even know how much of the problem will kind of, mushroom into. And I think that what's important now more than ever is understanding that in order for the long-term survival, the long-term thriving of the human population, we need to get creative. We need to be innovative. We need to be looking at things differently. And the way to do that is by having an intergenerational team to put a whole bunch of heads together and come up with ideas that maybe, have tried and failed, or maybe, were before their time, or, when they talk about, when I look at Forbes and I look at the big leaders, the big thought leaders in how a company is going to survive into the future, the key to surviving in the future is creativity and innovation and adaptability. And the only way that you're going to get those things is by not having a homogenous mix of people all caught up in the same groupthink. You need to get a mix of people all thinking and bringing everything to the table, and then all of you sorting it out and working it out and figuring out what's gonna work next. So if the key to a company's future success is being creative and being innovative, you can't do that without a homogenous workforce. You look at places like, when, we look at past fails of things, like BlackBerry didn't want to change. Well, they didn't want to change. They weren't thinking outside the box, and they were overrun. We have an entire history of organizations that thought that they were onto something good. The ability to pivot, or the opportunity to pivot, came, and they said, no, we're gonna stay the course, when in fact, had they pivoted, they would be in a completely different position right now. So it's being agile, right? It's being able to pivot, and the way that you do that is by actually being able to bring a mix of things to the table, right?
Yeah, this is a theme that we explored in a recent podcast around the right amount of, and there's no answer to the formula, it's the right amount of homogeny and divergence, because if you've got all homogeny, you get no innovation, no adaptability. But if you have full divergence and you have everybody running off in a different direction, and so it needs an element of, I'm not talking about, I'm not talking about, I see you processing that. I'm talking about an anchoring to a mission and
Yes.
and the intent of the divergent group. So it's not divergent, diverse.
No.
So you can be every intersectionality and diversity should be welcome in the workplace. So no question. What I'm talking about, though, is that diversity has to be focused with a common mission to achieve what it's going to achieve. Now, I need a scientist to explain this, but at what extremes of diversity do you become unable to focus on mission, and what are those diversities? I'm not even sure where they exist or what they are, because it's like I noticed for me in my teams, I need people pulling in the same direction, and I need them pulling in the same direction quickly. So I'm solving problems of mission first, whilst having a mindset for diversity. And and again, I do not have the answer, but it's something I've been mulling over. What is the right mix of homogeny and diversity?
I think that if you go back to what you just said about the mission, right? The idea of hiring a diverse workforce is not to have 40 people all following their own mission, right? And all operating on their own kind of, trajectory. I think that team building, and that's really what we're talking about here, team building still requires that finesse of coming together and working as a team and having shared goals and talking about stated values and understanding the mission, right? You still have to have a foundation, right? And that foundation is what actually brings that diverse team together and focused on going forward. You still need to have those underpinnings. They don't go away, right? So when we were teaching this course recently, the organization had just issued a new mission statement, and don't want to give away their IP, but we took every single thing that we were talking about, whether it was diversity in hiring, whether it was appreciating neurodivergence in a workforce, especially in a STEM workforce, and how we manage neurodivergence in that kind of a situation. We took every single one of those ideas and linked them back to their values. So how is being diverse, how will that actually help you deliver to your values? What are you going to do to actually help deliver to those values? So I think that it's not the Wild West. It's not about just, opening up the doors and saying, hey, bring whatever is in there. You still have to have an organizational structure. You still need to have a foundation. And as you're trying to tackle problems about how do we fix this or how do we fix that, or, what can we do to make this different, you're going to still want to come back to those basic foundations, the basic principles. What are the motivations? When you want to get in voice of the customer, add voice of the customer into this, get the mix of the people that are going to be affected from this, listen to what they're saying, but also how can we deliver to our principal drivers, which is, in the case of the bank, when I was there, the big thing under Sir Ralph Norris was to be number one in customer service. So everything that we did, every system that we designed, every product that we launched, every, branch that we opened was all about how is this going to improve customer service? How is this going to drive a better experience for our customers? And then, of course, I kind of came along and said, well, that's really good. And I love that we're delivering to our customers because, being an American, we're kind of, we aren't all Karens, but we do have a certain level of service that we like to aspire to. And I said, but let's not just deliver to our external customers, let's deliver internally. So let's get the teams working better together so that they're all on the same page and we're all working to do that. So it is about having that the tie that binds, I think, is important. And I think that that keeps and reins in and focuses that divergent thinking and that wild kind of, wild sense of innovation. We still need to have, fence. We just make the fences a little bit, bigger, and every now and then, we need to bring people in and drive to a conclusion. And then so there has to be a cycle. But to your point, I think that, no, you don't want 10 different people going off in 10 different directions. That's why a company has a mission, it has a purpose, it has values, and that's what you have to keep on tying everything back and drawing those things back to the core of what you're really trying to achieve. And ultimately, it always comes down to, giving the customer what they want. How are we going to do that? Rather than telling the customer what they want, let's listen and give the customer what they want. It's a concept, right? So.
I mean, there's so much in this, Elsa. We've been talking for an hour. We could probably go for another 3. I might take this for the logical pause. We've talked about Ikage. I'll say it incorrectly again, just once more. We've talked about competence over prestige. We've talked about relevance. We've talked about the costs to the US economy in underutilizing the 30% of underrepresented mature workers. We've talked about the declining birth rates. We've talked about the challenges of prejudice and cognitive bias, which is stopping this untapped pool being utilized in the modern workplace. And I have to admit, you've inspired a few things that I would like to write about. So it's been an incredible amount of time that we spent together. Is there anything else that you think you'd like to cover off here, or do we call it a day?
I think if I could end on one thing, I think that is especially now very critical for the world at large, it's to really start applying critical thinking skills to the information landscape that we find ourselves sometimes submerged and oftentimes drowning in. Every way that we have been previously, historically, received our information has been very cut and dried. We have relied on newspapers, and we have relied on television presenters, and we have relied on, authorities to be telling us the truth, to be giving us the facts. And once upon a time, I think that did work that way. But now media and information has become another consumer item, which means that it's no longer fact-based, it's targeted to get response and pull and drive and create income at the end. That's why everything has ads attached now, right? So I think that now more than ever, people need to consider things carefully. I think that people need to consider their sources. When I do these courses and I bring forward a lot of statistics, I make sure that there is at least 2 or 3 I can always have a hard time saying this word, just like reputable sources that are actually sharing the information. So I think that, if we were all to start embracing the idea of critical thinking, and when somebody says, yeah, just the other day I saw a pig fly, and then Joe says, oh yeah, I saw one too, you go, let me just ask a few questions about that. Let me just better understand that piece of information. We are so quick to consume. We've grown up in a world of fast food, fast fashion, fast everything, that we no longer kind of take that moment to pause and reflect and go, really? And I think that is probably something that if I would end on the note of anything, it would be to understand why people are telling you what they're telling you and what their end game is in giving you this information. What do they want to get out of it? And is that is that what you want? Do you want the same thing that they want? Or do you really want to know, the truth about things like, climate change? The truth about things like, and I know it's a sensitive subject, but the truth about vaccines. 145 million people's lives have been saved, they estimate, in the last 50 years through the use of vaccines. Recently, we were told vaccines are bad. Did some of them turn out to be not so good? Yeah, some of them were rushed to market in a bid to control things. And certainly there were some people that did have contraindications, but they told us there would be contraindications. They even gave us an estimate on the number, and the number of contraindications is still lower than the number that they told us to expect. But instead, the hype is all about this rather than celebrating this. So I think that we all need to get better at critical thinking and recognize what the media is telling us and why the media is telling us that, and to just ask more questions.
Yeah, got it. I like it, actually. Ask why people are telling you what they are telling you.
Because they have a reason. There is an underlying reason.
Yeah, got it. It does send me off down this rabbit warren of how and how we apply this to everything we were talking about so far. But yeah, yes. It does lead into the first question all the way back. What do you care about at the moment? And so we've talked about critical thinking, utilizing people of maturity, and understanding that there is a lot of I'm going to say ignorance, but intentional manipulation of the way that people might see a mature worker for whatever reason, and a whole load of other stuff. Look, Elsa, again, thank you for your time. It's been a real good one. I'm going to press pause now. Don't go anywhere. Hold on.